Okay, Jefferson, are we going? All right, I didn't see the yellow box. That's an inside joke, folks. Welcome to Fresno State Creative Writing Alumni Association reading for JJ Anselmi. We're super excited about this tonight. His book, Doomed to Fail, is out. It's amazing. First, I want to say, if you haven't gotten it yet, make sure you go to bookshop.org and order that book. It's phenomenal. We'd also like to thank those at the Fresno State Alumni Association, Nicole, Corrine, and Donna for your ongoing support. And also special thanks to Matt Schultz for all you've done for the creative writing chapter and for the university. We'd also like to thank the Creative Writing Alumni Chapter Organizing Committee, Camila Okafor, Courtney Hughes, Ethan Chatanye, Steven Sanchez, Esmeralda Gamez, and Gabriel Ibarra. Tonight we're going to be, this reading is going to be moderated by Stephen Church, and Carissa Ellison is going to be managing the Zoom room. So thanks to her for helping us out with that. She's keeping all the rebels from making this a bad Zoom session. And of course, I can't thank Jefferson enough, but Jefferson Beavers, he makes these things happen and he's awesome. He's the man. One thing I'd like to mention before we get started is that you can set it up as a gallery view if you want to see everybody, but while JJ is talking, I highly recommend that you change it to just focus on his face. And that is up there in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You'll see an adjustment there for gallery view versus just the sole performer. If you have any questions you'd like me to send to Stephen as JJ is reading, please respond to me or to, I think, to Jefferson also, in the chat room that's right down there, the center of your screen, right there below you. Just click on that and send in a question, and I will log those and send those to Stephen as we go. All right, so Stephen Church, take it away.
Hey everybody, thanks for being here. I just have to say, first of all, it's so cool to see all your faces. I haven't seen so many of you in a long time. John, your beard is epic. So I'm really happy to introduce JJ tonight. JJ is the author of Doomed to Fail, the incredibly loud history of doom, sludge, and post-metal, as well as Heavy, a memoir of Wyoming BMX and heavy fucking music. He's played drums in several heavy bands, including In the Company of Serpents and Former Worlds, and currently in Drainage, a sludgy metalcore band from Long Beach, California. JJ, as I think most of you know, is an alumnus of our MFA program here at Fresno State. And we're in the enviable position here at Fresno State of having trouble keeping up with all of the accomplishments of our alumni. And JJ, frankly, is one of the most challenging to track because of his voluminous output of work. He is, and honestly has been since I've known him, one of the hardest working writers I've ever encountered. I feel very lucky to have worked with him in the program. I remember when John and I were recruiting JJ, just knowing that there was something special about him, something different. Not just his subject matter, but his approach to writing, which I think is roughly analogous to his approach to music. Heavy, beautiful, and relentless. I'm very happy to welcome him back, so to speak, and to talk with him today about his new book, Doomed to Fail. JJ, it is so great to see you again. Thanks for joining us. I think what you're going to do first is give us a little bit of a reading, and then afterward we'll have some Q&A. So welcome, JJ.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks so much, Jefferson, Ronald, and Stephen for such a kind introduction. I wish I could be in Fresno hanging out with everybody, but here we are in this weird whatever void that 2020 is. But yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm super glad that yeah, we could at least connect this way. So the part I'm going to read from doesn't really need much explanation, I don't think. At least I hope not. It's a chapter called Of Concrete and Glass. And yeah, it's from my recent book, Doomed to Fail, which again, I seem to have a knack for super subtle subtitles. So in case you couldn't guess, this book is about the incredibly loud history of doom, sludge, and post-metal. This is called Concrete and Glass. When it comes to bands like Grief, New Thrush, and Primitive Man, the distinction between sludge and doom becomes hazy at best. The sonic difference between a sludge and doom band is sometimes clear as day. Other bands meld doom and sludge into an indistinguishable stew. So part of me can see why people say those labels don't matter, that it's all just really slow metal at the end of the day. A different part of me sees good reason to distinguish between doom and sludge. Sludge is typically of the world, whereas doom tends to reach for something larger and more ethereal. Even when the punk influence is more buried than it is in Melvin's or I Hate God's music, sludge bands often focus on social ills like economic disparity, humanity's incessant drive to poison the earth, and widespread addiction. They typically provide snapshots without solutions. Look at this shithole world. Here's music to match it. I've never heard a poet say that distinguishing between romantic and concrete poetry is pointless. Sure, in the broadest sense, it's all just words on a page divided into lines and stanzas. Those words come from very different places, though. Romantics sought spiritual enlightenment through language. Concrete poets focused on images from daily life, wanting to ground their art in the real world. The latter is true of many sludge musicians. This is a long way of saying that Grief is a sludge band. Grief released its first EP, Depression, in 1992, with a cover that shows a sea of trash reaching toward a blank factory and smokestack. The 3-song record feels like one long and horrible bummer of a track. If you want to ruin a dinner party, just play Depression. Same goes for 1993's Dismal LP. That album's noxious, bass-heavy tone is a plastic bag over the face of hope. On its cover, a forlorn child sits on a mound of trash, resting his head on his palm and staring at the ground. From beginning to end, Dismal hardly varies, which is why it's so crushing. The LP mostly adheres to a single crawling tempo, and most of its riffs are similar, so it all congeals into one toxic mass. Black Sabbath's riffs seem like Britney Spears hooks in comparison. All told, the LP is an exercise in erosion of the self, optimism, and if played at the correct volume, the eardrums. Listen to either of those early recordings or any of Grief's albums in full. If you said you don't feel hopeless afterward, I wouldn't believe you. Grief hooked up with Century Media for its 1994 follow-up to Dismal. With improved production that doesn't dilute the band's toxicity, Come to Grief has become the group's best-known record. Even with major label support, however, Grief was always destined for the underground. As it turns out, getting your self-esteem grinded to dust isn't everyone's cup of tea. I've been listening to Come to Grief on my commute from Long Beach to Santa Monica, a 30-mile stretch that's typically gummed up by enough traffic to make it a 2-hour drive. Similar to Dismal, Come to Grief feels like one long piece, riffs blurring together to achieve the same draining effect as an album of harsh noise. Guitarists Savastano and Hayward lock themselves in a box, limiting their parts to low notes that are barely distinguishable from each other. Hayward's gravel gargling screams dwell in a similarly confined space, while Donovan bludgeons his drums. With those bleak sounds coming from my speakers, I absentmindedly stare at red taillights slithering toward a smog-obscured horizon. During the writing of this book, I relocated from Minneapolis to Southern California for work and to escape winter. Of course, I get drunk on the sunshine, but I also think a lot about the big one, that ultimate and perhaps inevitable earthquake that could destroy the West Coast. I also think about the extinction phases the Earth has seen and how many scientists believe we're at the beginning of another. Whether it's through an extinction phase or some other catastrophic environmental event, it's not hard to imagine that our planet would eventually slough us off like fleas. Even people who deny climate change know in their hearts that we're only beginning to see the extent to which we've shit in our own nest. And yet we line I-405 like ants, climbing over each other, rubbernecking, and huffing carbon monoxide. Come to Grief is a fitting soundtrack. Aside from a few isolated sections, like the blues-drenched riff that closes third song World of Hurt, and the drunken swagger of the title track, there aren't any earworms on Come to Grief. It's aural misery. In Dr. Seuss's book, There's a Wocket in My Pocket, a stubborn bird-like creature called a newthrush appears on the narrator's toothbrush. But that newthrush on my toothbrush, the boy says. Well, some are nice, but he is not. Same goes for the band. Newthrush came to life in 1994, arising from the punk scene that spawned Neurosis. The cornerstone of that scene was Berkeley's 924 Gilman Street venue, which has always championed progressive and anarchist politics. By then, Neurosis had already begun its still ongoing exploration of the unconscious mind. Newthrush followed a route similar to the Concrete Poets, focusing on the most negative aspects of humanity. Inspired by grief, bassist vocalist Gary Niederhoff and drummer Chio Nakaga wanted to craft the slowest, most aggravating music they could, finding like-minded musicians in Louis DeVilla and Tom Choi. Newthrush wasted no time, recording 3 EPs that first year, but Choi and DeVilla weren't long for the band. In 1995, Newthrush found its permanent guitarist, Russ Kent. Like a lot of underground bands who tour and record tirelessly with no prospect of making a living on music, Newthrush has seen its fair share of lineup changes, with Kent, Nukaga, and Niederhoff serving as core members. They comprise the current Newthrush lineup along with vocalist Dino Somisi of sludge grind legends Dystopia. If sludge is horribly slow hardcore, then Newthrush is one of the genre's purest practitioners. Its songs are dissonant punk burners steeped in sewage. From 96 to 99, Newthrush didn't really stop releasing 7-inches, feeding music to labels such as Monkey Bite, Bovine Reservoir, and Clean Plate. As if the group's hardcore roots weren't clear in its sound, that tenacious approach to releasing music firmly located the band in punk's underground. Corrupted and Newthrush put out 9 splits, some with heavy bands like Corrupted and Sloth, and some with power violence groups like Black Army Jacket. Within that 3-year period, compiling those songs on 1999's Erode the Person. If I ever start a suicide cult, I'll play that record on repeat on our big day. Newthrush utilizes samples from TV shows and movies to create a sense that its music is just another artifact floating in a sea of cultural detritus. Die Naga begins with a sample of Mr. Rogers, that white bread, awkwardly sincere TV personality, talking about angry music. When you're feeling angry or sad, or maybe when something makes you feel afraid, he says, do you ever make up a dance, or stomp your feet, or punch an old pillow? Or do you have a loud song that you sing when you're angry? And then, as if intentionally introducing a Newthrush song, here's some loud music, which seems like it's saying, I'm angry, I'm very, very angry. An iron curtain of sludge crashes down. That curtain weighs on the chest for the entirety of failing early, failing often. Sludge's promise that anyone can play music has unfortunately been digested by more white dudes than anyone else. Chio Nukaga, who plays drums with bolder fists, shows the genre's potential to evolve. Speaking about her musical beginnings, Chio said, music brought me to Oakland from San Jose in '98. I was renting a room in a 3-story, 9-bedroom brown shingle house in MacArthur for $187 a month. The house was affectionately known as the compound. I remember a Sunder played in my roommate Jerry's bedroom. It was awesome. It was a grittier scene at the time when bands like Sleep, Grief, I Hate God, and Nausea started coming through. I was inspired by sludge and the slower, doomier side of drums. Ellen of 13 and Lori Black of the Melvins, which this is a random factoid, but Lori Black, the bassist she's talking about here, is Shirley Temple's daughter. She went on to become this gnarly sludge bassist. Ellen of 13 and Lori Black of the Melvins have been two of my biggest female inspirations musically and otherwise. Style-wise, I wanted to drum like Chris Heikius. Chio's brother first inspired her to play heavy music. From there, she discovered the Bay Area's vibrant underground scene. I fell in love with 924 Gilman Street in the late 80s, she said. After seeing local bands like Neurosis and Asbestos Death, I realized how lucky I was to be living in the Bay Area. Some of Nikaga's favorite New Thresh shows have been ones with grind and power violence groups. Shows when her band was by far the slowest on the bill. Those mixed bills were common to the Bay Area throughout the 90s, inspiring people to experiment with melding sludge, grind, and other subgenres to craft ever more negative vibes, an approach Primitive Man has since perfected. About what made her gravitate to sludge, Chio said, "The feeling I get from playing sludge is absolute bliss and sadness. I think sludge can bring a lot of emotion up from within that can be very exhausting because of the nature of truth. It seems sludge always has a place in life because of all the sadness and anger the world has, based on earth and the decaying part of it. When I think of doom, I think of bands that are more metal influenced with sad melodies. Sludge is more punk influenced, like slowed down crust and often more political lyric-wise than doom." And then this last part is also the last part in this chapter. In the first episode of Portlandia, Carrie Brownstein and Fred Armisen sing a song called "The Dream of the 90s is Alive in Portland." Primitive Man is a destroyer of dreams. The hopelessness of grief and New Thresh is alive and well in the Denver trio. Guitarist vocalist Ethan Lee McCarthy has DIY written into his DNA. In addition to playing in grind bands, Clinging to the Trees of a Forest Fire, and Vermin Womb, he's run multiple all-ages venues in Denver, providing a necessary alternative to the bar scene. When I lived there, McCarthy, along with some other diehard musicians, ran a space called Blastomat. With hard-to-find records and merch in front and a dilapidated skate ramp in back, Blastomat shows felt vital and down to earth. Primitive Man's music contrasts starkly with that welcoming vibe, reflecting the negativity its members see in the world with hope eroding walls of noise-laden sludge. McCarthy does the artwork for his band's records, communicating his broken worldview with photographic juxtapositions that depict the waste, chaos, and terror of modern life. The cover of Home is Where the Hatred Is shows 3 naked people with American flags covering their heads like plastic bags. They sit at a picnic table covered with guns and knives. Every Primitive Man release deserves praise, but 2017's Caustic is the fullest realization of the band's misanthropic intent. With commanding amplification captured through brilliant production, the LP epitomizes the depressive sludge aesthetic Grief and New Thresh developed. Caustic has spurts of grind and hardcore, but most of the record stays anchored to one monotonous tempo that lurks in the 45 beats per minute range. That's slow enough to alter brainwaves. As with the aforementioned band's albums, Caustic erodes the psyche, especially when played in full. Joe Linden became Primitive Man's permanent drummer in late 2015. His drumming is stripped of ego, with sparse hits that worsen the bludgeoning of McCarthy and Campos's riffs. While playing riffs that snap like rusted machinery, McCarthy introduces abysmal roars into the hostile ecosystem of Caustic. He doesn't scream about wizards and dragons. about the record's lyrics, McCarthy said, "I write about race relations in it. I'm black and white, so I have a perspective on that, which I haven't written that openly about for Primitive Man ever. I wrote about some of that stuff, as well as depression and mental illness. And then about direct conflict with people, which I haven't really done with Primitive Man either. There were some recent events in my life that I was affected by so strongly that I had to write about them. And there were a couple deaths I had to write about as well. I guess if I could sum it up, I was having a hard time in my personal life, and I felt like the world around me was turning to shit." Just a little side note about that. Ethan didn't really want to throw people under the bus, but since it's closed reading, some of what he's talking about there is Denver, like many punk scenes, has like a just old shitty skinhead contingent, and I think he dealt with it when he was growing up as just kind of like a young kid that was super into grindcore and crust and doom. And then I think they kind of, buried their heads in the sand for a long time. And then for whatever reason, they reemerged in the years when he was writing Caustic. When weed was legalized in Denver, it brought a lot of changes, some good and many bad. Denver's economy saw an immediate boost. Developers bought cheap property and demolished old buildings and houses to make room for breweries, dispensaries, and high-end burger joints. Rent in those areas skyrocketed, and people were torn from their own neighborhoods. While many Denver businesses are thriving, people are also struggling to make ends meet with paychecks that haven't caught up with the price of development. In the song Commerce, Primitive Man's static trudge combines with McCarthy's roars to reflect those harsh realities. Shackled to the bottom of the bottle, he bellows, of the socioeconomic slavery that rules and runs my life. Worked to ruin, infected with poverty, left in the gutter, overworked, underpaid, from a system meant to fail us. Amid the aberrant slog of disfigured, McCarthy utters, though light-skinned, I will never be free, a ghost and an alien eviscerated by race relations. In the same way the wounded deer riffs of the record congeal to paint one grisly canvas, so too do McCarthy's lyrics. As if wage struggles weren't enough, the vocalist points to the fact that we live in the opposite of a post-race society, despite what Fox News pundits might have us believe. Sawteeth of grind and raw hardcore crop up throughout Caustic, and the last song, The Wait, disrupts the record with sparse noise and samples. All told, the LP's social commentary is on par with Public Enemy, but Primitive Man's form does more to echo its content. Caustic is a broken mirror, reflecting the world in all its ugliness. Yeah, it's one of those moments I wish I could be with you in person. For one, to enjoy your company, but also for some kind of inhuman cues, or in-person cues. Inhuman ones you can keep to yourself, I guess.
Thanks, JJ. That was awesome, man.
Thank you.
JJ, I wanted to, there's a lot of things I love about your book. I thought a lot of those things were on display in your reading. It feels like to me like you're taking a musical genre that kind of scrapes at the underbelly of American life, and you're kind of scraping at the underbelly of that music. And both this book and your previous book deal with this idea or this experience of heaviness. And so I don't know, I'm just like, what are like the essential elements for something to be heavy, whether it's music or writing or art?
Yeah, that's a super good question. I think at the end of the day, it's just that kind of visceral gut feeling when something is, good to the extent that you can feel it on some level. And so, yeah, that's one thing I've always loved about writing is that, I don't know, it might sound kind of cheesy, but just these like pieces of cardboard and paper you can pick up and then, they just spear you in the chest. And then music, I think, is the same way. There's tons of music that I consider to be extremely heavy that isn't necessarily metal. Really, like half my listening routine is like gross metal shit, like is in the book, with Cookie Monster vocals, as people like to say. And then the other half is just hip hop, basically. And so, yeah, I feel like, so much of that stuff is just incredibly viscerally heavy, like Public Enemy kind of mentioned at the end of that chapter. Or I've been listening to a lot of Earl Sweatshirt. And yeah, it's just that whatever level of artistic accomplishment, I guess, that just somehow creates a physical reaction. And then heavy music too is also, I feel like there's, it has kind of has a trump card in a certain way, because like Primitive Man is a good example of when you see these bands, it's just this insane amount of amplifiers and guitar cabinets, and it's gotten so extreme and like very, very specific. And like there are a lot of times, like Primitive Man, it's like these really expensive boutique amplifiers that these guys essentially who, if they're making any money, like Primitive Man, if they're a super popular band for that world, but if they're making any money that is even like close to paying the rent, I would honestly be surprised. And so they're touring and buying this insane gear and all this shit just out of obsession. And so, yeah, of course, when you see that stuff live, it, damn near knocks you to the floor, literally. I mean, it gets to the point where it's actually dangerous without earplugs, which is so stupid. It's awesome, I guess.
Yeah, like I thought that was really interesting. Like there's a physicality to it, right? You can feel the music,
Yeah.
and I guess like in the best writing, maybe you can feel that as well.
Yeah.
So JJ, obviously we're doing this for the Fresno State Alumni Association, and what we want to talk a little bit about is kind of what it's like to be an alumni, to leave the MFA program. Your first book was a memoir, which was pretty much your MFA thesis, if I remember correctly. I mean, obviously with some edits and changes.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about the difference between that first book out of your MFA and then the second book, and kind of what that was like?
Yeah. I think that first book for me is, and it seemed like, this is kind of a similar experience with a lot of MFA people, that, we kind of, a lot of us had like whatever story we were carrying with us that we really wanted to tell. And I know in a lot of cases, like, maybe we had tried a couple times and it wasn't quite there for whatever reason. And so that first book, really, I had like the story of what it should be for a super long time before I could really even write well, before like right when I first started getting serious about school. And so, yeah, I was just kind of carrying that story with me forever. And I tried to tell it in the year between undergrad and grad school. And I'm sure I've told you this story before. In John's first workshop, I realized I had to redo the entire thing, which, yeah, it's just, it's one of those things. I'm really glad that I did it, but I also hope I never have to, I don't know. I hope that there's never a revision process that's as ridiculous as that one, but who knows? I'm sure there will be. So yeah, that was just a story that I'd carried with me for years and years and years. And so it wasn't really much of I mean, there's definitely, moments of what am I going to write about in the MFA, especially for like your class when we do different research essays and stuff. But I mean, really at the end of the day, I had an idea of what that book was going to be for a super long time. And so after graduating, and then especially when that book was finally out in the world, yeah, there's that kind of feeling of the post MFA. I'm sure it's fairly common, of just like, oh fuck, what am I going to do now? And yeah, I faced a lot of that. And I think, to either to my credit or just, I don't know, just being like a complete caveman for whatever reason, but I would just come up with ideas and just chase them full on, just with all my energy. And a couple of them definitely hit brick walls. And so at first I wanted to do a 33 1/3 about one of the bands in this book. Let me close. there's this dude on the block who drives a really loud motorcycle and then blasts like soul and funk. It's pretty rad. Yeah. So yeah, it's just kind of like this oh shit moment, and I want to do one of those 33 1/3 books, which, you know, if people don't know, they're those, you might have seen them in record stores, or these little like pocket-sized books that are essentially about one album. A lot of them, you know, they kind of like get it, just a deeper story behind an album, or a lot of them feel like one huge essay about a record. There's some really great ones out there. And so I want to do one of those about this band called I Hate God, and the 33 1/3 submission thing, they have you submit a full-on entire book proposal, you know, just to make sure that whatever they get, somebody could actually write a full piece that needs to be that long on it. And you know, it's synopsis, it's sample chapter, it's draft table of contents, it's ideas for marketing. It ends up being like this 33-page document. And so when that got rejected, I was like, oh shit, you know, what am I going to do with this? And then I had the idea to just write a biography about that band, because if you read that chapter in the book, they're one of the most beat to shit metal bands ever. They're also one of the most problematic metal bands ever. And so I really wanted to cover all that stuff in the book. And so I did come up with a biography pitch and actually got it to the band and to the management. I should say that's one thing that I just continually love about this side of metal is, and it's also in you know, this kind of level of the writing world too, how accessible people are, you know, when you reach out to them. I'm just kind of continually surprised how accessible and within reach people are. So anyway, I sent them a biography proposal, and they hated it essentially, because, you know, there's these horrible, problematic, racist elements of the band. They say they were, you know, being ironic and they were just kids and all this shit. And it's just you could never write a book about that band without tackling all this stuff. And then, you know, they're a New Orleans band, so they went through Katrina. Their drummer died of a heroin overdose. It just goes on and on and on with this band. The singer was, you know, has been at death's door, pretty much every member of the band forever. Anyway, and so I really wanted the book to cover all that ugliness as well. And I figured too, if you're a band called I Hate God, you would want the book to be like what the band really is. This, you know, the book should be ugly too, like the music and like the band. But the vibe I got from, they're pretty pissed actually. And the vibe I got was that they wanted more of like just kind of a praising biography, which, you know, it just seemed like a bullshit book to write. And then after that, I tried to go with the band biography idea and do one about this band called Neurosis, who was much nicer, who actually, I met some of those guys at they did a show in Fresno, which is, they were just doing like an acoustic version of the band, which is kind of, you know, circling back, a little random tangent, but as far as like, you know, heavy music can take any forms, and acoustic being one of them, that show, it was just mind-blowing how much power and force they could summon with just acoustic guitars, basically. But anyway, so I wanted to write a biography about that band, Neurosis. They've been around for 30 years, which is just mind-blowing to me. And now it's even more, because, I mean, really, if you think about it, a band is like a marriage between all these people, and people's personality flaws come into play essentially immediately, and it can drive you nuts. But then they're also probably the closest people you know, next to your actual spouse or family that you'll ever be to in your life. And so I thought they'd be an amazing band to write about. I reached out to them; they were much kinder, and basically told me that if they're going to do a biography, they were going to have somebody close to the band do it. And so that idea got shot down. And again, these ideas, I'm just jumping into them full force. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this, and then just completely running with it. And it just keeps getting derailed and derailed and derailed. And then the last idea finally before this one was, I thought I'd write a full book on the history of amplification, which is actually an essay that started in your class. And I remember a lot of the feedback was like, this thing really needs to get longer. And I remember one of the things you said was, you know, it should basically mimic amplification and its unruliness. It should be this crazy, unwieldy thing. And yeah, I started writing that thing, and it was super fun. I was having a lot of fun with the writing for a while, and then something like, I don't know, 30 or 50 pages in, I was like, what I actually want to do is write a book about doom metal and the metal bands that are exploring amplification. And so, yeah, just this process of running and just slamming face first into brick walls. But for whatever reason, again, I guess it's, caveman mentality, growing up in a coal mining town or whatever, I don't know.
Yeah, I
Maybe
think
a little bit too hard-headed, but yeah, just running with that stuff. And then eventually it turned into something that, I'm super proud of.
yeah, it's evidence of a lot of hard work, clearly. And like one of the questions that we had from Carol was about about your research process, which you've talked a little bit about that, and about whether you interviewed band members. Maybe you could talk a little bit because the book is obviously very heavily researched. So could maybe talk a little bit about how that process worked for you, how you melded that research with the memoir stuff and the other things that's working in the book.
Yeah. For one thing, I think part of it was kind of cheating because I've been a metalhead since I was, essentially in junior high. So I was kind of informally doing research on this stuff for, I don't know, I guess almost like 15 years or something like that, of just like, if I think back to when I started reading metal magazines and reading about Black Sabbath and all that stuff. And so there was already just kind of like all this background knowledge that I carried with me just from being a ridiculous fan of the music. But then as far as like actually doing the research I needed to do to write the book, there were so many times when I would just kind of sit back and just like chuckle to myself, or just think how awesome, how fun it was to do this project, where I just say to myself, like, dude, your research is listening to all your favorite metal. Like, that's fucking rad. And so it was just like a good lesson for me to just, write about what actually excites you and get to a point where the research process is just fun. And then I think I did reach out to, pretty much every musician that I possibly could, and secured as many interviews as possible. And yeah, that ended up just being more of that same kind of fun. And I ended up, kind of making friends with like some of my heroes, and got to talk with like Buzz Osborne of Melvins on the phone and have this super long conversation. The dude who introduced Kurt Cobain to Black Flag. And so these figures that to me are just like so monumental, it's as big as anybody could possibly be in music in my head. So yeah, there was a ton, but it was just so fun. And if there were some points when I guess, I'll be real and say, like listening to like all thlike records in like really close succession. I mean, I did start to get like genuinely kind of like bummed out. And there are points where I'm like, dude, I like need a fucking break from this like super slow, depressing metal. It's like not being good for my headspace to only listen to this right now. But then again, I would just back up and say like, listen to whatever other more chipper record or something more upbeat, and then jump back into it and just have a blast again.
Thanks, JJ. I was wondering the same thing. Like, I'm like, God, so much of this is so dark and heavy. Like, how does JJ find light? Does he just listen to like Hanson or something? Or, but so one of the questions that we had coming in was about kind of the literariness of this book, and how the music community has responded to it. And then I guess similarly, how the literary community has responded to maybe the metalness of the book.
Yeah. I'm honestly not so sure about the literary community side. Aside from just people I know who are writers kind of reaching out and stuff. But yeah, this one, I mean, really part of what I want to do is just reach more into the metal community than I did with the previous book. And so yeah, there's been a lot of that. And it's just been, yeah, a lot of it has just kind of underscored what I love so much about this music, this kind of communal aspect. For whatever reason, when you meet other people who just love this, like really gnarly, abrasive music that is depressing, but at the same time, it's like, a lot of times I don't necessarily think of it as depressing also. Um, Something about, when we come together, there's this really like quick connection, much like when you meet a writer who, you share the same influences or something like that. And so, yeah, that it seems like the metal community has been fairly stoked on it so far. I'm not so sure about actually, I guess I could say, yeah, there's a couple other, like there's a book on the genre black metal, which is like the Norwegian stuff, in case you don't know, where there were actual like church burnings and a murder and this crazy fascist shit. But then there's also like people who took it to this interesting environmental place. And anywhere there's a book on that stuff, there's one on death metal. And so there's kind of a template for this book to exist. But one thing for both of those books is they don't really delve into that kind of memoir aspect, or they don't really do a whole lot of interpretive, I don't know, like essay work, which is something that I really wanted to do with this. And really part of why I want to do that is just to show people who might not be familiar with this music that there's so much more than maybe meets the eye, because I can totally understand, even, back when I was in high school and was into Metallica and Sabbath, I'd hear some of this stuff with like the really gnarly growling and Cookie Monster vocals again. And I was just like, that's so ridiculous. That's idiotic. But then, I mean, I kind of grew to realize like what the context is and where the influences come from and what they're actually trying to get at and what they're trying to do, and just makes you respect it on a whole different level. And so, yeah, I think that kind of literariness was a way to just champion metal in a different way, because, yeah, I do firmly believe that, it's as profound as any other type of music, art, what have you.
Yeah, JJ, I think, for me at least, one of the most literary things about the book is the way that you are scraping at that underbelly, and like using the personal to kind of confront some of the darker sides of the music and engage with it. And that's one of the things I really appreciated about the book. It's in some ways very straightforward in terms of like some of the things that it's doing, but there are a few chapters where you're doing some stuff that's a little bit different in terms of form and technique. You have like an epistolary chapter,
Yeah.
second person. There's even a to-do list. So
Yeah.
can you maybe talk about some of those choices?
Yeah, sure. That was definitely connected to the kind of, with those death metal and black metal books. As much as I loved them, there was this kind of redundancy to the writing. Um, and it just, part of it came from just like each chapter was the same, kind of following the same template every time. And I'm sure there's some of that in my book too, but I did try to avoid it by, mixing up with form. And also, I think that was a way to kind of have fun and remind myself that, metal is, it's trying to scratch at all these like doom, at this weird spirituality with, while also like trying to reconcile like spiritual beliefs with like this genuine belief that our world and society is not going in the right direction. And then the kind of sludge stuff that's much more concrete. And yeah, I mean, beneath all that stuff, it's also fun. There's a certain element of that stuff that's super fun to kind of, like in that last chapter when Shio was talking about just beating the shit out of her drums, there's always a fun aspect to it as well. And so I think that kind of messing with form and, kind of being a little tongue in cheek sometimes, like with the chapter on Death Doom, which is just like the levels of a cavern. And it's one of those things, I'm like, this is so stupid, but this is awesome. This is what I'm doing. And so, yeah, just trying to have fun with the form and, hopefully having some literariness to it, but trying to basically have fun in the same way that I do when I'm playing doom metal.
Awesome. Thanks, JJ. So, back to kind of this idea of, this the alumni chapter, thinking about the time after your MFA. I'm wondering what did you have to add to your toolbox, so to speak, after the MFA to write this book?
I I think part of it was just that desire to branch out further beyond, the literary community, is a kind of, really reaching out to music fans. And I thought it was kind of an interesting challenge to try to get people to read that might not necessarily be huge readers in their daily life. I thought that was a really cool challenge to kind of take on. And so I think that was definitely something that I, really, tried to expand my toolbox with. And I think I really learned from writing for like the AV Club in Vice, where they, they really champion like a, just very accessible tone. Some also, some kind of like surface level jokes and stuff like that to kind of keep the tone light and mix stuff up. And so, yeah, I think that's definitely a way of expanding my toolbox, and also just, I think I'll leave it there. I would say too, just, just the raw fact of being out of school and being able to write literally whatever you want is both terrifying and exhilarating. So I'm writing a fucking, like I said, when I figured I wanted to write a book about metal, I'm like, of course this is the book that you want to write. And so, really being able to just allowing myself to chase things, even though it might dead end. It seems like something that, you just don't necessarily have the time to do that in school when you're writing for a class.
Yeah, for sure. So that leads a great segue to our next question from Carol, which is, what are you working on now, JJ?
I'm doing this history of my small town. So yeah, I don't know, stepping back into, maybe of reaching out to more of a literary audience, hopefully, I don't know, we'll see. But kind of from that first book, and there's even a lot of it in Doomed to Fail, of trying to capture that place. And I still feel like I've only just begun to kind of scratch the surface. And I had a realization reading an oral history of punk and grunge, actually, that I just kind of, I realized that it's really people's stories from that place that really make it so gnarly and unique. And, I try to tell people, like, yeah, my small town, it's like this boom town, and everybody's parents and everybody is on drugs, and there's this insane suicide rate. And I try to kind of convey that gnarliness, but to me, it's I feel like I was always kind of falling short, whether, in person or in that first book, or in the kind of little portions in Doomed to Fail. And so I had this realization that some way of combining people's stories would be perhaps the way to do it. So yeah, that's what I've been working on. And it's been a cool, I had the idea for a while, and then with COVID, I just dove headfirst into it because, that lack of connection. And so it's been a really cool way to connect with people I went to high school with in a good way. I definitely have that kind of there's always the moments of like scrolling through Facebook and, see three people you went to high school with and you don't want to talk to them or whatever. But there's been like this really positive element of that, of just like talking to people that were outsiders in school that I kind of knew but didn't really know well, and hearing this whole internal struggle and just insane stories that were happening beneath the surface, and talking to people who lived in the early coal camps. And so this opportunity to just connect with all these people has been really, really rad, and makes it feel, again, not so much like work. It's been awesome just to talk to people.
I think it's safe to say, JJ, that sounds totally metal.
Yeah, I think in spirit, it's my one goal I always have I'm like, it should feel like a Neurosis record. I think of metal, and then I want my metal to be literary, so they shape how I think of the other one, which I guess is just like runs in circles and probably means nothing, but who knows.
So JJ, so many of your descriptions, particularly of drummers, I've noticed reach to imagery from the animal world. We've got orangutans and gorillas. I think there's a possum. So I guess I'm just wondering, like, if you were an animal, as a drummer, what animal would you be?
Oh man, Maybe I would be the missing link. I think I had a good buddy in Minneapolis, and a couple of my friends. I'll try to kind of put some like little like technical flourishes and stuff in it, and they'd be like, just do it, caveman. And these are like super musicians that are like far more talented than me that understand music theory, but they're like, just do it, caveman. And that was always the answer, like just do like whatever the most kind of basic but impactful thing you could do for a certain riff or moment. And so yeah, I guess a caveman. I did have my buddy. We did a short run of shows like a month before COVID started, and my buddy said that I looked like this really angry goblin. He said you're the nicest guy, in real life, but then when you get behind the kit, you're like this goblin that wants to destroy or something like that. So maybe this weird goblin caveman is my final answer.
Goblin caveman. I like that. That's great. I think that's good. JJ, I think that's probably the last question that we'll take for the evening. But I just want to thank you for reading, for sharing your time with us. It's been so great to hear your work and talk with you tonight. And thanks everybody for coming out tonight and for being here. I guess this is how we clap, and
Thanks so much.
I'm gonna touch all your faces.
Yeah.
All right.
It's been great to have a facsimile of seeing you all.
It's so good to see you all.
One of these years we'll see each other again. But thanks so much for having me. It's so great to talk to you.
Thanks, JJ.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ronald, Jefferson. Yeah, I wish I could see all of you. Yeah, Carol and other MFA. Yeah, friends who I haven't seen in far too long. But yeah, thanks so much. It's been great.